Hi, welcome. I'm going to introduce just briefly the panel, and we're going to structure how we're going to discuss the forum, because everybody has different elements to contribute. Peter is going to do a general slide, just to look at the growth of the market within the auction market. And then Touria will talk about the art fair market in general in Africa and beyond. And Lerato will talk about working for a gallery. But we're going to mix in different elements, like working in the curatorial vein and biennials, and just basically how the market has restructured in the last decade or so. So we'll start with Peter.
Yes. Very happy to be here, and even though I'm nowhere close to being an African art market specialist like you guys, I'm somewhat knowledgeable about data, which is, I suppose, why I'm here. So straight into a sort of a market overview where we can see in 2018, this is, I should say, African artists, modern and contemporary, who were born in Africa. So, I mean, you could count this in many different ways. You can look at the diaspora second generation, or you can just look at artists who are based there, I suppose. But for the purpose of the data I'm presenting here, we're looking at artists who were born in Africa, but then potentially would have moved somewhere else. It's made up of various sales channels, looking at the data coming from regular post-war and contemporary day sales, Africa dedicated sales in Paris and in London, also North African artists from Middle Eastern sales, as well as a Nigerian auction house. But I'll show you that in just a little bit. So in 2018, we saw $34 million in African artists' sales at auction. And comparing that to the two previous years, we could see it's slightly down from the look of it from 2017, but it might be a reason that we can have a look at later. But most importantly is that 2016, from 2016, we're seeing growth, quite substantial growth, both in 1 year and 2 year horizon. If we break this down by the various sales channels, as I mentioned, the first part is made up of regular post-war and contemporary day and evening sales in London and New York. So these are African artists being sold across these sales. And it's Philip Sotheby's and Christie's in this case. The second channel going into this market overview is the London sales of dedicated modern and contemporary African art, so Sotheby's and Bonham's regular sales taking place in London. And then we have the Piazza dedicated African sales in Paris. We have the share of artists, the North African artists in the Middle Eastern sales in both Dubai and in London. And finally, that is Art House, Nigerian auction house. There should have been South African house here as well, but a shortage of time left me dataless. So Strauss would have added another bit on top, but perhaps this will come in a future report. We can put it all together. So let's just see how this compares, the same type of breakdown over 2017 and 16. We can see that 17, the regular post-war and contemporary sales in London and New York made up a huge chunk, and this is primarily down to a few top results coming from some of the highest selling artists from the African continent. But what's really interesting here is looking at the dedicated sales, so the African auctions in London and the African auctions in Paris. In 16, we're looking at just over 3 million between both Paris and London, whereas in 2018, we're looking at 11 million. That is quite some growth within this sort of very specific, dedicated sector of the African art market. If we break this down by top artists, which is always something that's quite fun to do, we have Marlene Dumas as the very first name. So over not in 2018, but over the 3-year period, her market was the biggest out of all artists coming out of this region. Followed by Crosby, Benin Wonwu, Nigerian artists, Julia Meatu, and an Egyptian artist, Mahmoud Said. Pardon my pronunciation on all of the artists. And then adding all the other 630 artists from this data set I put together. So looking at just the top 5 compared to the remaining 630 artists shows a quite interesting distribution. Quite a lot in line with what we would see in other markets where you have a few top artists controlling the majority sort of auction sales. If we keep looking at these sort of top 3 artists, what's really nice here is that you have 3 living artists in the top 5, and they're all women. And then let's throw in a comparison with American artists. And the comparison is not from the same data set, but across all sort of major sales in London and New York. We see 5 men, and they're all dead. What if we compare this to the UK? Not all dead, but another 5 men. And this obviously ties back again to women in the market, women artists in the market that we had yesterday. And I suppose we might touch on this later when the real experts start talking. But I just wanted to briefly mention Crosby here. We put out a report late last year called the Next Gen Report, where we looked at artists under 40 globally. We looked at some 1,300 artists, and not the market. The market was a very small bit. We looked at museums, we looked at exhibitions, we looked at collections, private and public. We looked at social media following. We looked at everything you could possibly look at in an artist's career and tried to come up with a system where we graded it. It can't be sort of ultimately graded, but just looking at who is the most important in the eyes of everyone from all different angles. And out of these 1,300 artists, we mapped out the full career path. Crosby came in as number 1. A few other names from the African continent. There are more, of course, in the research, but these are some of the ones that scored the highest. So I thought again, I'm assuming that you guys will touch on some of these later, but we have, Tunisian, Moroccan, Algerian, we have South African, Angolan, Congolese, so it's a nice mix. Sorry. If we go back to the same auction figures again, and look at the age groups, and well, perhaps deceased artist is not an age group per se, but nonetheless relevant to look at. And we add artists over 40, and then artists under 40. This is quite a contrast to most graphs you would see on age groups within the market. It would be often the exact opposite. Deceased artists would have the larger chunk by far, and then you would have living artists. When you look at the top end of the market, of course, this is what I'm comparing to. And if we do another breakdown here, we can look at the gender split. male artists, and female artists. And again, it's really nice for someone who often sits and sees sort of 95% men, 5% women whenever we do summaries of auction sales or various markets, to see these figures. I could continue breaking this data set down in a million different ways, because that's what we do. But we should move on from here. But before, I thought we could have a quick look ahead to 2019. It's usually a good place to end a presentation. In the beginning of each year, we do something called an Outlook survey. We ask people in the industry from all over the world how they feel about the market in the next 12 months. And we ask the same question on sort of each of the major regions or continents. And for Africa, so this is not out yet. This is still, the survey is still sort of information is still being collected. So it's very fresh what you're seeing here. What we got on Africa is 47.6% believed it would go up. 41.3% believed it would be stable, no immediate change, and only 11.1% thought it would go down. And this is the strongest result we saw out of all the different regions, Middle Eastern, Latin American, American, European, Chinese, you name it, for African. And although last year's result was significantly stronger, I believe this is really just down to the economical and political situation we're in, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the African art market. It's, as I said, it's the top one in this survey. Well, from that, I'll leave it back to you. And
can you go back to the list of the different artists?
The younger artists?
Yeah, that you've got.
Yeah, let's see if this one works in that way. Yep.
This. Stop
Yes.
there.
Yep.
We'll talk around this. It makes it easier to talk around the subject. This list is really interesting because one of the most difficult things about the continent is people never realize with the growth that there's 54 countries. If you compare it to something like Latin America, where there's 12 speaking all the same languages, apart from one country speaking Portuguese, we have 54 speaking between French, English, and Portuguese. And what's very definitive about this, it gives you a real breadth of how intercontinental the growth has really contributed. So it's really kind of spiked the interest in the arts. There are many varying factors of how this has happened, but two of the key things are artists for a start, especially remaining on the continent and working on the continent. And one of the biggest factors is the market in terms of selling is an art fair. So we thought we'd kind of talk about these things in general. And with Touria, you started 154 in 2013. There was nothing. Yes. There wasn't much at the general art fairs, only at the top end, people like El Natsui.
Well, to be fair, there was Johannesburg
There was
Art
Johannesburg
Fair.
Art Fair, yeah. But in terms of internationally, tell us a bit what the connections were and why.
Well, the mission of 154 was always to give visibility to artists that I thought, didn't have visibility over the past, 20 or 30 years. And I mean, I laugh a bit about this data as much as is it true, but when you think about it, all those artists have been in auction house for the last decades, those, top category of young artists. When you take Marlène Dumas, she has been around for so long and so many decades already. So, I mean, there's very hopes for the new generation coming up. I remember when I started, 154, to just find things that were going or happening around contemporary African art. I know, Simon, you're here, but it was one of the sales I knew about, that took place in New York, I think in 2010. There was Bonhams also started a sale, that was focused on contemporary African art. But besides, when I started not coming from the art world business, I was sure that, looking looking at this business model, somebody would tell me, hold on, there's already 3 fairs that are dealing with contemporary African art in the international, global stage. I was a bit shocked by the fact that it had never, took place in Europe or in the US. I think the obviously landscape has changed enormously since 2013, and I can tell you just by little facts, like we started at 17 galleries at Somerset House in 2013. I think we had 6,000 visitors. This is a fair that started with no group behind, no capital or anything like that. So we never advertised. I never paid for a page of advert. I'm sorry for all the publishers, but we never had money to do so. But we had very strong editorial from the beginning, which I thank also the publishers for, because obviously that really helped the reputation of the fair and the credibility of the fair. But I remember, doing research about finding exhibition, and there was some very strong curatorial exhibition that took place before 154, but they took place at a pace of 5 years. Every 5 years there was a big African exhibition somewhere. So I'll say, the curators did an amazing job in promoting those artists before there was any art market platforms for them. But today, we are welcoming in London 43 galleries. We are welcoming 18,000 visitors in our, flagship fair, which is the biggest of the 3. We're able to go in 2015 in New York and started a fair there in Brooklyn at Pioneer Works. We're celebrating our 5th year anniversary, and it's been going stronger and stronger. And we finally were able to get back to the continent with the fair in Morocco. And I feel like, today we send a newsletter to all our collectors about what's happening around contemporary African art. And I remember in 2013, this newsletter could not exist because there was not enough, contemporary exhibition around the world. Now today, when I do this newsletter, we have to curate it. There's so many events happening around contemporary African art. And I remember also at the beginning, everybody was trying to compare African art as being a trend, like Asian art or like Latin America, and I was like, I hope so, but there's not enough happening, around it yet to make it a trend. And obviously you want constant growth, in all those artist market. But what's very interesting now is that for the first time I went to Art Basel, Miami, and I felt like it was a trend. Every fair had invited all the galleries from Africa. You had all the galleries with either African American artists or African artists. They all had picked up one. So now I feel like there's a real, engagement with the contemporary African art. So I'm really excited to see those numbers and how they're going to evolve, in a couple of years' time, because I can tell you that from 2013 to 2018, things have changed drastically for me, in terms of what we do, the demand of application we receive, and also, the type and quality of collectors that go through the fair.
And for you, Lerato, you work in a country where the art scene was pretty much derelict until 1990, 94.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was derelict. I think the structures were few and far between, but there's always been a very significant practicing kind of art world. I think when the gallery started 16 years ago, it was really in a time when, 2 of our partners had gone to Documenta and come back and started thinking differently about what a gallery could be, about looking at a different gallery model, thinking strategically around visibility and I use the word strategically carefully, because I think the practice of the gallery and the way we operate is really quite thoughtful and slow. We really do take care and love to putting it together and figuring out how we want to be presented in the world, how our artists are perceived elsewhere, how to reach broad audiences. So one of the core parts of our program is our publications, for instance, which we distribute far and wide, because for better or worse, we are at the bottom part of the world, and it is essential for us to be seen on an international stage and to participate in these international dialogues. So
just going back a bit, say once you started the gallery, when was the first time the gallery decided to do a fair? I guess it would have been in Joburg or Cape Town first.
No,
It wasn't. And from the fair to the gallery program, how long were you just selling to the local community, and then how did it expand from domestic? Yeah.
From the very beginning, we've been doing Paris Photo. Paris Photo is our very first Paris Photo. Is our very first fair.
What year was that? Do you remember?
It's about 10 years that we've been doing Paris Photo. I think we celebrated our 10-year anniversary last year. Okay. So that really felt like it became apparent. It was apparent from the very beginning that we needed to get out in order to be seen, and in order to be taken seriously, and in order to not miss out on the international dialogue. So as much as we pride ourselves in being located on the continent, and it's very important, our location to us, it is equally important for this location to be seen on a world platform. So, yeah, sorry, I forgot your question.
Oh, no. No, in the sense of the logic in terms of the different in selling towards the domestic market and selling in international, how did that affect the dynamics within the fair?
Yeah, I mean, Joburg was the first fair that we did on the African continent. And it really was a few years. It took about 6 years for us to start seeing progress and growth in the fair. So there was a moment where suddenly there was attention towards the continent, and I think one can attribute it to the strength of the local fairs, which of course did very significant work, but I think the visibility, again, at the international fairs was one of our biggest, moments of, like, turning points. Being in Art Basel, suddenly we are in the same neighborhood as the top 10 galleries in the world, for 3 days. So it really does make a difference. It really does cast a light towards the work that we're doing at the gallery in South Africa. And initially, I think there was only one African gallery at Art Basel. Now there's like 3. So it's growing, and that's really exciting for us, and it's really important. And of course, it's very important that platforms like 154, I suppose, exist for just to amplify this visibility. But there is a lot to be said about playing on a different scale as well.
One of the things that I found really interesting is the fact that even though you're a South African gallery, the program is now within, it represents artists throughout the continent. And for you, even though you're, the fair also is looking throughout the continent, some of the things I find in these things when they quote Africa is 80% of it is one country, and then there's like 2 other countries in between. How did you go about basically reaching out towards out of the continent, and within the continent, and not just locating it to South Africa?
I think from the onset, we were looking at artists elsewhere, artists in the African diaspora. Our program initially started with what was around us and the artists that were doing really important work in South Africa and Southern Africa, and then Africa, and then America and everywhere else. So it is about looking at a particular kind of sensibility, a particular kind of dialogue and politic that I think aligns to where we are in the world. But it's not. We are not exclusively an African representing gallery. I mean, we work with like Vivian Sassen, who's Dutch and is in Amsterdam. So there's space and I think fluidity in our program. And it has always been really important. I mean, we started a Forex program many years ago, long before I worked at the gallery, which brought artists to create an international dialogue, brought artists to South Africa often for the very first time. And I think this was also in response to the situation in South Africa where there were very few art institutions up until 6 years ago. There were very few art institutions that were able to do these ambitious shows, to bring these, to kind of keep their pulse on the international dialogue. So we started it as a response to that. partially just because there really was very little going on the continent, well, at least our part of the continent. And fortunately, these institutions have sprung up in the past couple of years, and we have a little less responsibility on that front, because I don't think it's healthy for it to have remained in a commercial space. I think it's important that these happen in independent public spaces. Yeah.
And with you, Peter, how do you feel with, one of the feelings I get with this is that maybe the market is still relatively young in terms of the effects of the auction market. And how do you feel, in a sense, in the plus and the minuses of what it gives to the contemporary art scene in Africa? If it's a good thing that you're documenting all these things now, or do you think it needs, I don't know, 10 years to grow?
I mean, it's for sure. It's a very in a global sort of perspective, comparing it to the big sort of London, New York sales. Can't really be done. I mean, if you look at, I think the whole African continent, like the market share within sort of the big post-war sales, it's comparable to Romania in the last year, and that's all the countries.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then Romania had Kenya that had, superstar kind of. But I mean, we're seeing similar superstars in Crosby, for instance. Just a lot less out there on the market. No, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think, I mean, it's you can't really look at it this way now, but still, it's quite.
Do you feel in a way that the results represents a conciseness of the continent, or do you think it's still a little bit one-sided? Because one of the things I discussed with you is when you looked at the map and what was going on, there were countries where there was literally nothing, and then there was varying countries where there was like so much going on.
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, you do, but it's. I think what we discussed is that you have Bonhams that is almost like a Nigerian sale. So looking at that, we will see a huge sort of portion of the market being Nigerian art, and that's not at all true. Looking at the sort of bigger art world, but it is what we're seeing sort of being channeled into London, into Paris, into New York as well, to the sort of the major sales there, or the North African artists that do appear in Dubai or in the Middle Eastern sales.
I mean, that's another aspect we can talk about, because these sales don't include North Africa. So we're talking about literally south of the continent. They do.
These included as well.
They do that, but they're usually they're separate sales.
They're usually usually sit in the sort of Middle East and North African sales, or they're usually just called Middle Eastern sort of modern and contemporary sales. And that's where you see sort of Egyptian, Algerian, Tunisian, Moroccan artists. So if you only look at the Africa dedicated sales, or most sales on the continent, I suppose, apart from the Moroccan house, the name has left me now. You wouldn't see a lot of North African artists, because they are primarily picked up within sort of the Middle Eastern market
but we see
context.
that changing with Sotheby's. I think they're including more North African artists. So I think they're getting back that North African part from Middle East and North Africa, which I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but they have tried to include more of North African artists in their sales.
Which is good, and I mean, we're also to blame for that. I mean, our report on Middle East includes North African artists. So when we look at that market, we look at that region because it's how the sales are structured.
But you're doing that, you're doing that with your fair, which is the most interesting thing. You're looking at 54 countries.
Yes, we always have included North Africa, but it's true that even in perception of the audience that are visiting us, they are expecting more sub-Saharan African art than they are expecting North African art. We never made a point of separating anything, but the reality is that sometimes people are expecting to see more sub-Saharan art in 154. So for even us, we had more time, even if I'm Moroccan and everything, like to convince North African Gallery to do 154. Took a bit longer at the beginning. Now they're all for it, but like it took a good 2-3 years to get them convinced to do the fair.
And just moving forward a little bit, I want to talk about some of the difficulties and challenges of working as a dealer. south of the continent. In terms of representing artists, you're far away.
Yes.
The relationships with artists and how it's evolved over the years.
Yeah.
Oh, and how it's also contributed to the uniqueness of the situation in terms of it's one of the few avenues where there is a kind of positive growth in every aspect. Even though it's slow, it's still getting there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me try and respond to the difficulties of being a dealer. I think those are international difficulties. Of course, we are additionally, tasked with the geography situation, which is, I call it a situation, not a problem, because I think there are a lot of positive aspects to being located on the African continent. Yeah. But we are very far away. Everything is very, very, very expensive. Our currency is absolute shit. So it is hard, but it's not impossible. And I mean, like the gallery in and of itself, I think maybe just looking at the model of the gallery and how we've grown, I think that's the clearest sense of growth that I can see, that I could speak on. We're now 11 partners. We're all part owners of the gallery, which is a very interesting structure that, it's few and far between. So we really work in a collective sense. And I think we do that, we take that kind of principle of a collective sensibility in how we work with artists too. It is very quite, we have very, very great relationships, I think, with the artists that we work with. We keep our list very alive, very fresh, like very connected. It's not about just having this really like blockbuster kind of list where we're entirely invested in having active relationships and dialogues with the artists that we work with. And I think that goes a long way in terms of nurturing these relationships, nurturing their careers, and codependency. I mean, we would not exist without our artists. If anything, we really would not exist without our artists. And that's been acknowledged internationally, I think. I mean, I was looking at our list, and there just under 50% of the artists that we work with galleries abroad, so galleries in Europe and the US. Most of these relationships have developed in the past, say, 5 years, which is an interesting thing to notice. Yeah.
And Touria, I want with 154, I want to look at different aspects of things, because one of the things you do is not working with galleries, but working with artists, but you also work with curators. And I want you to talk a bit about other elements that you think have contributed to the growth in the market, in a sense, because I know when you were doing the fair in Marrakech, you were originally going to time it with the biennial at the time, which then didn't happen. And do you think those other avenues have been a kind of a positive influence on?
Well, our strategy from the beginning was always to piggyback on like something else, so we knew we're not big enough and important enough to like be on our own in London at a particular time period, and people didn't know much about contemporary African art. So we made sure we're in parallel to an important, contemporary fair. So that's why we chose strategically to be during Frieze and like leverage on their collectors being town, to discover contemporary African art. We also knew that it was for the first time that a lot of people would discover contemporary African art or contemporary art from the continent. So we thought it was very important to have what we call today 154 Forum, which was basically a platform for critical discussions, different artist talks and performances and anything that could, surround and give more gravitas to the fair, and for people who wanted to know more, that they could attend also that program. So we did something, maybe completely different than the large fairs. Like we chose, instead of having a selection committee made up of, galleries that did the fair, we created a selection committee with an independent selection committee, where there was a curator, the director of a famous gallery in London, but had nothing to do with contemporary African art, and myself, that was playing a bit the how you say, the arbitre, telling them not to, if, I knew more of the story of the galleries than themselves knew. So I think it was quite important because the the director of a London gallery had a good eye of what would work for London, you know, for the London audience and for the people coming for Frieze. And the curator, you know, had the respect of all the artists because she had worked with them in quite a couple of exhibitions, you know, and she had an amazing eye in terms of, you know, letting us know the galleries who had the, you know, strong programs based on the continent because she had worked with them in the past. So I think that honestly, all those factors were extremely important to build the reputation of the fair. I think that, you know, having a more curated fair because we're small and we're allowed and we're able to do it because we don't have to manage 300 galleries, but our largest fair is only 43 galleries. So we do have a personal relationship with all the galleries that are doing the fair. And I think for a lot of them, it was the first time participation at an international art fair, or at least based in London. You know, for a lot of the artists, it was for the first time that they would have been, you know, in an international exhibition, call it a fair, but it was, you know, their first global stage appearance in a way. A lot of our catalog, even thinking about the catalog, you know, most of the fair have catalogs that kind of promote the galleries. We had to do the opposite, you know, way where we were promoting the artist instead of the gallery, because for a lot of those artists, they were completely unknown for the visitors and very difficult to find on the internet anything. I'm talking 2013, things have changed, but a lot of the biographies did not exist for those artists. So we had also to think of a catalog where, you know, you would leave the fair and you wanted to know more about the artist. You had, you know, a reference point that you could refer yourself later on to. And I think that all of those like things that seems to be, you know, maybe issues for other fairs, like having galleries churning or, you know, not having enough galleries for their, I mean, we have the opposite because there's so many new galleries opening up on the continent. There's so many, I think it's probably the only continent with so many projects or new museums that have opened or private space, art space, you know, every year there's at least 5-6 new things, you know, coming maybe from the 6 or 7 countries you're talking about, but still I think I don't see that much of like new museum in the US, you know, or new museum in Europe, at least when there's one opening up and it's new, we all know about it because there's only one. But I have to keep up with what's happening on the continent. There's so many different things happening. So I think that the idea of having a more curated show or being more small, and I think it's a lot of those models that the fairs are now discussing. We started like this, so this is our model. We're small, we have a strong relationship with the galleries, you know, we know the artists, they come all to the fair, you know, it's very important for us to have them as well at the fair. So I think most of the success also of the fair is like the experience of a very intimate you know, fair where they have still a chance to have a gallery who's willing to explain things to them and like have the artists often present. You know, I know a lot of artists don't like, you know, big fairs, but I mean, in our case, we're lucky enough that they love to be there. So we made sure that if they're not present because of the forum and the talks, the galleries have to bring one artist as part of the fair. So there's always some nice group of artists present during the fair.
I'm sure you get most people applying to the fair, but is there any time when you find things that you go to someone and said,
Yes, so we have obviously a lot of fairs do that, but we have the special project as well. So what we've realized is that with the increasing interest of the international audience to African art, that they still did not make the trip to go to Africa to discover some things. So they're willing to come to the fair in London or in New York, but they're not yet willing to go. And I'm not talking about Cape Town, of course. I'm talking about coming to Dakar, for the Biennale or, the Bamako Biennale. So what we thought we could help in those points is like give those special spaces to highlight some events, that were taking place in Africa. So for example, one year we did the Addis Photo Festival, where we gave a space to the Addis Photos Festival. One year we gave a space to the Fondation Zanzu, that takes place in Benin. Like we had the chance to do an exchange collaboration with the Biennale of Dakar, with Simon Jamy in New York. A lot of the New York collectors did not not know about the Biennale of Dakar, so it was a very nice way to engage them with the Biennale, and a lot of them sign in to go the following year. So I mean, what for us, the only time we work directly with artists is every fair, but it's on a project, So for example, at Somerset House, we have this very ambitious large-scale sculpture. So this is, something that we commission an artist to do. Obviously, a gallery is involved, but it's about us choosing a project that will, obviously benefit the fair, but also, Somerset House would agree to have such a sculpture because it's a public sculpture in their courtyard. So there's a lot of things that come in. But we do work with artists on a direct engagement when it comes to a special project, not, as a booth or as a fair. It's really, it has to be some of the, it could be a performance, it could be, a sculpture, it could be a video, that we will show of a certain artist. But we mainly, our main clients are, the galleries, and this is our business, it's a selling show at the end, like you want the gallery to sell.
You briefly mentioned in just what you said about biennials, which we discussed earlier this morning, was a very important part of the growth, and it's about curators placing artists in the context of their work, but especially things like with Angola winning the Golden Lion in I think 2013, South Africa came back in 2011, but one of the key biennials that we always talk about that really ignited the growth on the continent was the Johannesburg biennial, which was in, I've forgotten the year, 96. Didn't last 96, 97. Tell us a little bit about why it was kind of a spark.
I think it was a seminal moment where we had the attention of a lot of the world, or some of it at least. And I think for South Africa and the continent, really, it was the largest kind of curated project where, Oliver Eliasson was on the Joburg Biennale, big moments happened. It's the first time that a lot of international artists were seen on the continent. So it really was a turning point for a lot of galleries conceptually, and a lot of, not just galleries, but the landscape of the arts on the continent, and the imagination of what was possible and what could be done. And that's why it's always a reference point. It continuously inspires exhibitions. It inspired the birth of our gallery and others. So it certainly is a seminal moment. I just wanted to completely off topic, but to go back to something that Touria said about trends, and also that this is the space, on the continent where there are multiple museums and spaces coming up. I think I'm cautious about the term trends. I don't think anybody necessarily wants to be a trend, because trend is something that starts and disappears. But I think also it speaks to this kind of rise on the of interest on the African continent is really just, I think, if I were to reduce it to one point, it's just that we're not being ignored anymore. I think it's we're just not being ignored anymore, and as a result, more spaces are emerging on the continent because suddenly there's a market, suddenly there's a visibility and a sense of attention, and people are coming, and we're coming out. So I think to say that there's exponential growth of spaces is absolutely correct and true, but it's from zero. It's like there was nothing, and there's now something. So I think it's difficult to look at statistics like that and look at them as this kind of boom, this particular kind of, we've got the attention of the world. I think we're just normal now. We're being looked at in the way that a lot of places have been looked at, and people are even over it.
But drawing from that, tell us about the way forward. What are things that you want that you haven't reached or aspired to yet?
Look,
Both,
I think, I think a lot has been done, but there's still a lot to be done. There's still, if the galleries in the room all looked at an African artist and, looked at their programs and add an African artist, then we're talking about something here. There's that is visible change, but we're not there yet. And I think there's certainly a lot that we can all do to contribute, to just pay dues where they are due, I suppose. Yeah.
And you, Touria, in terms of you've now got 3.
Yeah, no, I would definitely think that, for all us African, it's definitely, increase our collector base locally, and I think when I see the numbers, even in Marrakech, which is based on the continent, 95% of the work is still being bought by international collectors, so, I think if I wanted this growth to go somewhere, it's definitely, get the troops on the continent to start buying their own art and hopefully not go straight from not buying art to buy a Picasso, like them to kind of first support, African artists, from either their region, their city, they don't have to go far, they just have to support their local art scene. But as I was saying earlier at breakfast as well, I'm also very optimistic because all the collectors that I've met on the continent exist. There are plenty. They are not your usual collector as defined by, your international market that buy at auctions or at galleries, but they have been for the longest time the only patrons of certain artists in their country. And it's very hard today for them to understand that they have now to go through a middleman or through a fair or through galleries and pay that commission, while they had this personal relationship with their artist who's dining at their table every night. It's a whole different model. So there's a lot of education that we need to do, and we do a lot of that, in between the fairs, trying to go meet some more collectors from Africa, trying to convince them to see also the work that a gallery, normally a good gallery, does, like a catalog, promoting them internationally, placing them international collection in museums, etc. So I think that, honestly, I'm very hopeful. But if we really want a sustainable market from an African continent perspective, this is definitely where we see and we need to see growth.
And Peter, just going back to your auction reports, was there a way within that you could break down the buyers in terms of
the buyers,
the origins of the buyers for the.
No, I would love to have that data.
Yeah, that would be interesting. No, just looking at what Touria said to see in terms of even the African art fairs, which countries are buying it within the continent in comparison to the Europe. Yeah.
No, the only part I would have that kind of data for would be the big evening sales in London, New York, because then we can spot buyers or track sort of the expert on the phone and so on. But I'm not sure if, it's such a small portion, right? So it wouldn't really be.
For us, similar. I'd say like 70% of our sales are international to international collectors. So there's a very small collecting base on the continent. And even of that 70%, half of that percentage is art fairs, and the other half is just kind of the time, after following an art fair.
Just an exhibition.
But the point is that there's a small collection base on the continent, and I think this is where the local fairs come into play. That does feel like the opportunity for the local fairs to really become active, and Cape Town Art Fair and Joburg Art Fair, just of the two fairs we do out of 3 on the continent, really have been growing. I think really have been trying to nurture and cultivate this local collector base, and I imagine you guys are doing the same thing.
Are you taking the same kind of work from Joburg to, say, Nigeria? Or is it very... It doesn't matter. It's interesting to see,
It's an experiment every time. It really is. We have a much smaller booth at ArtX Lagos, which we've been doing for 3 years since the beginning. Obviously, Joburg and Cape Town, we can do way more because it's home base and we can walk artworks over, not ship. So it's much easier to play around with what we do on the local fairs.
Okay. Should we do some Q&A? Sorry. There's someone behind there.
Is it working? Oh yeah. I'm just curious. We read a lot in the general.
Do you want to stand up?
Sorry,
that's okay.
We read a lot in the general press about Chinese economic interests in Africa. I'm just curious to know whether that's reflected in any way in the art scene?
For me, not at the fair. I'm not seeing yet any group of Chinese collectors coming to buy a contemporary African art. Maybe I should go and check it out there, you know, but like not enough to think that there's a strong interest yet being reflected from their investment in Africa to, you know, their investment in art coming from the continent.
Anyone come?
No, I think I mean, I think predominantly those figures come from infrastructural investment and really not cultural at all in any way, not at least from our end.
Yeah. Saying that, I did sell my first work to a Hong Kong collector.
Ah.
I sold an African painter. Yeah, that was the first time in 10 years. So.
I was wondering, just based on my experience with other emerging markets in Asia and the Middle East, and what you sometimes see is a lag of infrastructure and the governments not taking care of their own contemporary market and the arts and culture. Do you find that is this all owned, backed by private individuals and private, and does that hinder the market and keep it closed? Because it seems to be doing fine and growing, but do you think eventually the governments of the various countries are also going to get on the bandwagon and stand behind their artists?
It's 99% private. I think probably needs to remain that way to stop all the political shenanigans that goes on. You need to separate them, and also the countries have got other things. For me personally, I'm Nigerian, so I would rather my Nigerian government concentrate on Nigeria as a infrastructure building and let the private wealth deal with the art side. I think it's a good balance. I mean, you can have people, you know, things like with biennials, they do get involved, I mean, like with the Venice biennial. But
no, I mean,
yeah.
I do think this. I think the opposite.
Yeah.
I think it would be amazing. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but it would be wonderful if governments were interested in culture. I think there's a function that culture fulfills that, you know, of course, they're pressing demands. That is a reality. Like when there's no housing, you need to address that situation before you can pay for a biennale. But that said, I think there is a value, and I think there are ways that the government could think laterally around the question of culture. It's always a last-minute thought. It is demotivating that in order to fund a project on the continent, you need to appeal to the foreign funding institutions, Goethe Institute, Pro Helvetia, not the South African ones. So it would be nice if it wasn't only privatized. I think there's important value to public funding. Yeah.
For you too.
I'm trying to think about examples. So most of the young, you know, biennale that we see on the continent are usually privately funded, and they're actually often started by an artist or in that kind of like initiative, because in their country there's absolutely no infrastructure for art, and they think it's a great way to get people or an audience, you know, getting engaged with art in general. But I mean, I know that we had a huge problem, and you mentioned that, so I didn't touch on it, with the Biennale of Marrakech, which was a great biennale for 10 years, but it was privately funded, privately started, and obviously at one point that privately person said, I don't want to fund it anymore, so the government has to take over if they want to continue it. And this is where the problem started, you know, like they were not really involved with the project because they had not been involved from the start, and they didn't know why suddenly after 10 years, you know, they had to take over I feel a project that they had not started. But I mean, in Morocco, and I'm giving an example where I was extremely surprised, is that the Minister of Culture had done something amazing, which was financing 50% of the Moroccan galleries showcasing their artists in international art fairs. So I had 2 or 3 Moroccan gallery where the government was paying 50% of their booths at the fair. But it was the only occasion where I've seen that, and obviously with the different Minister of Culture, this nice initiative changed, you know. But to be fair, you know, like I can talk about like some country or some project that I see that I see government, you know, really trying to get involved or trying to be much more open about what's going on or getting a clear understanding what is going. Morocco is one. I know Tunisia has like a lot of support, you know, from maybe the Arab Spring slowed down things, but there was a time where, you know, they had a different structure that was helping also the different cultural platform, but mainly everything is privately funded. And and in a way you might be a bit right, you know, in terms of like not having any obligation to the government when they fund something where you have to maybe do a specific exhibition for them, or like, and I mean, I don't want to criticize Joburg Art Fair, but I know they receive, I think, city funding, and then they have to show, I think you had this year a wing of
the Department
local.
of Trade and
Yes.
Industry, I think.
So
funds
then you
a
have
booth.
obligation, and it's not automatically the quality of what you would probably like to show or like to support. I mean, I don't know. I would feel very annoyed if, you know, in Marrakech suddenly I had the government telling me, no, not this, but this, and like, you know, you have to give us a space, and just because they gave me some support. So I mean, I don't know. I think that I might go with Bomi on this privately funded initiative for the moment, you know.
You know, one aspect of it that has reared its head is the reparations of classical works. A lot of governments are very keen on that. In terms of Senegal opening a museum, that has been an interesting one. So a lot of governments are now saying, we want our works back, we'll build something to give. That's been interesting.
I mean, I come from,
Yeah.
just to last point
Yeah.
on the matter, I come from a country surrounded by South Africa, landlocked, Lesotho, when for years we haven't had a museum. There isn't one. And there's a small kind of museum project, and then suddenly they have decided to build a national museum. And that's an incredible moment, but at the same time, I know that government funding and the government kind of commitment towards a project like that and seeing it through is limited. They're going to build a structure, which they have, and then that's it. That's the end of... So I think my argument is, you know, see it all the way through, understand the kind of, you know, be involved in the cultural dialogue, contribute towards the national imagination in this manner. If governments were allocating actual programming funding towards Johannesburg Art Gallery, for instance, which is like a dilapidated, incredible treasure with an
Stunning
amazing
museum, by the
collection,
way.
but the roof is falling. So because, you know, the government doesn't care and they just keep erasing posts and essentially won't let them have a website. Like it's not there, even though it really is, and it has this incredibly, have Duchamps in their collection and like incredible things. So that's more where I was going, not so much in the commercial realm. Like I don't think governments necessarily should pay for commercial galleries per se. You know?
Thank you very much to all of you for being here today. I think it's absolutely wonderful, and we can all be in Barcelona and learn about the African art market, which I imagine, as me, nobody knew about before. So I want to thank you about that. And my question goes to Touria. I was wondering, you briefly mentioned that you didn't come from an artistic background, and now that you're running 3 international art fairs, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what made you go from a completely different sphere of business to take the initiative to create what wasn't there.
Okay, so I lied a bit about not being in the art world, because my dad is an artist, and he was an artist, sorry, and he basically was probably one of the most established artists in Morocco, often considered figurative modern, but still like so. But I never thought I would follow in anywhere close to his path or anything, except that in the last 10 years, I think he gave me the chance, and also I saw him slow down, so I was working on him on different exhibitions to support him. He didn't need me to build a reputation or anything like that, but I really enjoy, you know, doing those collaborative work with him, and I think that it probably gave me a push of wanting to just do that at one point. And then I had the chance to work for a professional corporate, you know, American company who sent me a lot to the African continent that I might have not visited otherwise. And I was selling different solutions for government in Africa, you know, like, and unfortunately when you have meetings there, you know, like a meeting can happen one day, but then it can happen a week later. So I think it's part of my old professional life that made me stay and discover some local art scene on the continent. So I had the chance to see all this amazing art, being stuck there on weekends, on holidays and things. And then I was like, coming back in London where I was living, or like traveling in the US for my job, and I couldn't see any trace of what I was seeing, on the continent. And I was very surprised because I really liked it. And I was like, okay, if I'm so passionate and enthusiastic about what I see, I'm sure somebody else in the world, should be. And actually, I have also to thank the same job for give me the option to actually come back from Africa to live in London and cover the UK market for them. And this is where I decided I didn't want to do that. And I was ready to maybe start, with what I was seeing, thanks to them on the continent, the fair. And I basically took whatever saving they were offering and was able to start the project and take 2 years of my life to actually concentrate and build the fair. So I'm not coming from the art world, but I think, I'm coming from the business world. Part of my job was business development, so it was developing market that didn't exist. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, we can compare things, but I know I built expertise in a whole different corporate world that helped me maybe not be too scared of certain aspect of building a fair, but I saw it more as like, building a new market, how to start a business model from there, I guess. And then, I had the chance to surround myself with great people who give me amazing advice. I had a great advisory board that a lot of them still are on my advisory board, but also, like it's about having people telling you that it's a good idea at one point, that because it's quite a long, I'll say, path when you're an entrepreneur and you really believe in an idea, but it has not been done, the way I wanted it to be done in London. So, and not coming from that industry, so I think people were very welcoming in general in terms of the people who gave me time in exploring, that idea and what I was trying to do. And I have to say, I'm thinking every time, and she's like, stop doing this. I just had 1 hour with you. But it's Shinal Wagstaff, at the time was the head curator of the Tate, because somebody introduced me to her. And they were like, well, she's giving you 1 hour of your time, but like, you have to have your question ready, like, make sure you don't embarrass yourself, etc., etc. And she was, first of all, the sweetest lady I ever met. But then she just made me realize how important the project was in general, which I didn't really realize. I thought I would do a fair. It was like a nice project, etc. But she said something. She's like, remember that it's the first time that often those artists will be represented on an international global stage, and you have to give them justice. Like, you can't do it lightly. You can't do it without like just thinking of it as your own little project. But like, a lot of those artists will be for the first time exhibited to international collectors, etc. So I think that conversation really made me realize the weight I had on my shoulder, not to just do it very lightly. So I tried to apply a lot of seriousness when I choose the artist, not being from the art world, but not trying to mess up too much, with the three fairs.
Merci.
So I had a question. You begin talking about Latin American artists, 12 countries, the same language, and you speak about the continent in Africa. So which countries are the most important that show the art? That is one question. And the other question, what is with African American artists?
Thank you. So, I mean, when it comes to the fair, so it's very funny because they all have three identity, So I can tell you, like, I feel, and this is my opinion, it's not based on any fact, but there's a huge correlation between the stability of a country in Africa, their economy, and how developed is the artistic scene in that country. So you still see, and probably as you saw at Bonhams, there's some country that there's not much happening, but I don't think it reflects the auction. It really reflects the fact that there's not yet infrastructure or gallery there. So to be honest, today we're working with 6 to 7 countries, where there's actually quite an, dynamic art scene, and the rest you might have one gallery that is actually the agent of changing everything locally because they're the only, gallery in that particular city. When it comes to New York, for example, I never thought, that would mix African American with 154, although I thought that there would be an interest for African American artists to be part of 154. But then we suddenly had requests conquest of like kind of established artists, you know, that really felt that they had some African heritage and they wanted to be at 154. So then we started working with galleries who had some African American artists who wanted to be part of this narrative and this diaspora. So we do have now artists, you know, that belong to this African American, you know, group. We also have in the US, which we don't have in London, a large group of African American collectors who are collecting African American artists, but also African artists, which is something very specific for New York, you know, not something that I can tell you exists in London yet or anything like that. But I think it's because this group of collectors don't travel to London for 154, but in New York, they do come, you know, from different states of the US, and they buy either African American artists that we're showing or African, you know, artists. So this is something very specific to 154 New York. And then in Marrakech, you know, we always, as I said in the beginning, had quite an interesting challenge in convincing North African galleries who, because of the Arabic language, are often more turned to Middle East than they are turned to Africa. You know, this is more about the culture rather than, you know, where they belong geographically. And this is, you know, where also we complete what we're doing with Morocco, because it's a French-speaking country. So we attract a lot of French collectors and Belgian collectors, which we don't automatically have in New York or in London, because they're less attracted to come to a country they don't speak the language. And also we have more, not so many, but we definitely have more African French-speaking collectors who are coming to Marrakech because it's French-speaking. So the language, as much as, you know, I never thought of it as a variable that would, you know, help one fair or the other, you know, make it very specific to Morocco. We have more North African artists, we have more French-speaking collectors, go figure out. But like, this is something that...
So which countries in Africa are the more active in how you call Africa continent, you know?
Yeah,
which
so
countries?
I mean, I always wanted to underline, you know, the fact that, you know, we're talking about 54 countries, that there was a diversity that I wanted people to realize, because basically now you're going to leave this room knowing there was 54 countries in Africa, but a lot of people don't know there's 54 countries in Africa. So in terms of, you know, not wanting to categorize all the African artists, you know, into a big country, which I still have plenty of friends who tell me, oh, last summer I went to Africa. I was like, where? You know, like, yeah, you know, you have to give me the country you went to visit, but it's still something that they use, you know. And I will say, to respond to your question, it's Nigeria, Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, but South Africa has been leading the way, you know, for a very long time. Did I say Nigeria?
Yeah,
yes.
Nigeria, yeah.
And I would say
Ghana.
Kenya and Ghana. That's where you see things.
7 countries.
7 countries.
but then you've
Ethiopia,
got
a bit.
Ethiopia,
yeah.
Angola, just slipped
Yes,
in.
yes.
Maybe. Yeah.
So, and also people who decide to come on the global stage as well, because there might be something in the country, but they're not yet interested to cross over, to come to 154, to do any international fairs yet, you know. So sometimes they come themselves first, then they apply, you know, the following year. I mean, I remember, you know, a lot of those galleries had their first fair experience with 154. They had never gone to any fair before, you know, so... but now in a lot of those countries, you have 5 to 7 to 10 galleries, you know, and it's just the beginning. So I'm just assuming that, you know, in a few years.
And how is the interest from these countries in international artists?
It's interesting. It's a good question. So it's a bit like, you know, if you're a French collector, you might start with French artists, even if, I mean, I don't know, but like, you know, like it's very difficult for somebody from Nigeria to feel right away connected to an artist from North Africa, you know, from Morocco. If you start collecting from something, he will probably start collecting, you know, Nigerian artists that he's interacting.
You start domestically normally, and then you go out. And depending on language, like we just said.
Yeah.
So you start, if you're Nigerian, you'll start with Nigeria, then English, Africa, then you might go to the French, and then you're like, oh, Portuguese-speaking side.
So it's a very cultural influence.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
I think so. At the beginning,
conservative, no?
And I think you see more and more now contemporary, you know, African collectors going to auction houses. So they might be introduced by Bonhams or by Sotheby's to other, and I'm sure this is what Sotheby's and Bonhams are wishing for, is that, you know, those collectors, you know, with the large amount of money who are starting collecting, you know, African artists from their country will transition into collecting, you know, bigger artists from their their night sales or their day sales.
Yeah, I mean, I know a number of African. Sorry, I don't think it's conservative per se. I think that's too generalistic a statement. But I think I know a number of local collectors, particularly South African, just because I know more South African collectors than I know others, that are collecting on an international scale. Some are on committees and museums internationally. So it isn't just African collectors buying African art. And similarly, it's not African galleries representing African artists.
Well, I think the collectors you're talking about, but if you think about it, there's only 2 or 3 from South Africa who are on the boards of patrons.
I mean, this is just like the
what I'm
board
saying
thing.
is like,
I'm not saying that it's... but I mean, how many,
and it's because they live between New York and South Africa, and I mean, I think they're very particular cases, but you're right. I mean, there's a few.
I think there's growth. I think it's slow, sure. But I mean, it's slow, as you have pointed out, in general, having local collectors and cultivating a local collector audience. So the problem begins there.
But it's also not just us. It's also, I find it's also some aspect of the Western world. It's like they don't, when they want to buy African art, they have a very limited view of it. They always think, or for some reason, classical art, or they'll think of, like you say something like Julia Moretto, she's African. So is that kind of, it works either way. The most involved market, I think, are the Americans, because they've been collecting African art for much longer time. And they have no colonial history, so they don't see any gender in terms of the different spheres of phones. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
I don't know if there's one more minute question.
Yes, no, so it was a fascinating panel, first of all. Peter, one of your questions was the projections for 2019. What I would be interested in is how this group sees the projection of the market for African art 10 years from now. Because what is so interesting when you look at all the waves that have taken place in the market, the geographical waves, let's say. There are also much more local waves, like there was the East German wave at some stage in Europe, and the auction houses were the first to always catch these regional phenomenons. So there was, you mentioned the African sale, that the auction houses are very happy that you mentioned the one we did in 2010. And but consistency, I think, is absolutely key to make it more than a wave, and to make it something then that really becomes a major factor. And I feel if I had to make a prognosis, I am extremely optimistic about the future for the market for African art, because you have the combined support of the auction world and of the gallery world. And I think that the key is your fair 154, because you don't have other fairs that are specifically devoted to one region. In fact, I find a big disappointment when you go to many art fairs all over the globe. We are a traveling circus, and we travel every day of the year to a different place. And basically, we look at the same things everywhere. And this year, for instance, during Freeze, I mean, I always love to see any art fair, and I've never been bored looking at an art fair. But this time I was slightly jaded, and the way I judge it is if there's anything that I would like desperately to buy for myself, not thinking of any clients. And I didn't have that at Freeze. And then on the last day I went to 154, and I was so excited, and I was stimulated, and I loved it, and my 8-year-old daughter loved it, and we had coffee there, we met some of the artists. It was a fantastic experience. And so I feel that this combined, two-pronged approach with what is happening in the auction world on one hand, and with what is happening in the fair world is creating a solid basis for the future development. Because if there is no consistency, then it's just a wave that comes and goes. And when you look what has happened with Russian art, or with what has happened with Indian art, or it's very interesting, the difference between these phenomenons. And what you do need very much is to develop the local market, because it cannot be subtained à la longue if it's purely non-African or mostly non-African collectors. So it's very important to develop the African base of collectors. Sorry, it was a long monologue more than a question.
It was a very
but
nice.
My question is how you see it, the long-term perspective.
So to be honest, like I agree. I only see positive, and I'm very optimistic about even the artists, because what Bonhams or Sotheby's doesn't show is that we, as I was explaining, this morning when I had this conversation at 4, had the chance to have the price list of the fair since 2013, to now, and there's some artists that you don't see, but they've grown by 200%. Okay, they started very low, but in terms of where they are now and where they've been placed, and the career path of those artists in 6 years is just incredible. And this is with just, as you say, a few players in the game, And to be honest, as much as I love my fair, I'm also a very independent fair. There's no big group behind 154, financing or backing or whatever. So we are doing whatever we can to the extent that we can. We do a lot of events, locally as well, trying to meet the collectors, etc. But this is a continent job. It's not just 154 job. It's every actor in the country that needs to really play its own part and develop those collectors. But I really feel like there's a chance to maybe. And I really feel we had a constant growth. I don't see any bubble, in my way. When I use the word trend, it's for the first time in Miami, I saw so many of African artists and so many of, galleries or artists, trying to showcase that particular artist in that moment in time. And I've never seen it before. So for me, it was quite new, because usually with the specialized art fair, but I went to Art Basel, I was like, oh my God, what's going on? I went to Entitled, and suddenly, you had 7 of my galleries there. And I was like, oh really? They invited 7 of them in one go. It was quite different for the way I was seeing things. So I think that, in that way, I'm very, very excited, because I see that now they included more and more, in international art fair. I really hope that we, can go to places where people have not yet discovered contemporary art from the continent, and maybe that's also the future, is giving a taste to what we've done, in different countries and different, continents, maybe that didn't have access to contemporary art from the continent. But I definitely, know that in 10 years those numbers are going to change, and that amount of millions that you see there is going to be a completely different landscape, just because I see it just with the maybe 450 artists who represented over 6 years, at the fair, and how their career path have changed since 2013. So and I think Simon is right. I think we're benefiting from an amazing landscape of auction house really supporting what we do. We also are not, I don't know if somebody mentioned that to me yesterday, but it's true. All the directors of the sales of the contemporary African art, are dealing with galleries or dealing with artists sometimes too much. They're too involved with the artist, or but there's no different borders between an auction house, the galleries, and the fair. All those people are mingling all the time. Sorry, it's finished. It's 5 o'clock. Okay. Sorry. I have
Red
a red.
It's 5 minutes. Oh no.
No, it's
Oh no, it's gone. Oh,
oh,
okay.
it's gone.
Okay.
Okay, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
So maybe
We have to fly.
Yes. So maybe
Yeah.
you say your
Oh, she wants one more
your
last
10
question.
years projection.
I hope that it is good. I hope it is upward, but I cannot predict. I don't know. I think based on the interest that we've had over the past couple of years, we're growing and growing and growing, and that's a good sign. And I think it is upward. I want to say just that list that you have, just because it was there, is amazing. But it's of the 10 artists, contrary to the auction results, of the 10 artists, 3 are women. So it's not, these statistics are often warped, which is something that was pointed out in, I think, the women artist panel yesterday. We're not really on the right side of the women thing either, although we strive to be.
So I'm sorry to stop it now, otherwise you won't get to the plane. I think it has been really enlightening, and for many of us in the audience today to know more about the African art scene. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.